Latin America isn't collapsing country by country, it's collapsing all at once. From Mexico to Argentina, 7 nations are spiraling into what experts now call a system-wide failure. A cascade of blackouts, bankruptcies, border crises, and criminal takeovers. Hospitals without medicine, cities without electricity, governments that no longer govern, cartels that now act like states. This isn't just instability, it's the death of stateness, the collapse of a region's ability to tax, to protect, to even pretend it can help its people anymore. And the scariest part? Each collapse is making the next one worse. This is Latin America's multi-country meltdown, how it started, how fast it's spreading, and why this time no one is coming to save it. Let's break it down. Mexico isn't a failed state, it's something far more dangerous. A state that shares power with criminal empires. Right now, between 77 and 101 million Latin Americans live under what researchers call criminal governance. That's not a breakdown of law and order, that's a deliberate system where cartels provide security, resolve disputes, and enforce rules, acting as a parallel government. And nowhere is this more developed than Mexico. Groups like the Sinaloa Cartel and the Jalisco New Generation Cartel aren't trying to overthrow the government. They don't need to. They've created a duopoly of force. 2 governments operating side by side, each controlling different territories, different populations, different revenue streams. In communities across Mexico, if you have a problem with a neighbor, you don't call the police, you call the cartel. They settle disputes, they punish thieves, they keep the streets safe. Not from violence, but from the wrong kind of violence, the kind that disrupts business. This isn't chaos, it's order, criminal order. And here's the truly disturbing part. This system is positively correlated with state presence. The more local government agencies you find in an area, the more likely you are to have a criminal governance. The cartels aren't filling a vacuum, they're operating alongside the state, creating a hybrid system that neither side wants to fully dismantle. Why would they? The cartels get legitimacy and operational freedom. The governments get plausible deniability and a way to outsource security in areas it can't afford to patrol properly. But the cost of this devil's bargain is staggering. Mexican cartels now produce the fentanyl and methamphetamine that kill over 70,000 Americans each year. That's more American deaths than US soldiers in the entire Vietnam War, except this happens every single year. They are present in more than 100 US cities, operating distribution networks from Seattle to Miami, and the Mexican government's own experts admit they can't stop it. Not because they lack the firepower, but because dismantling the cartels would require dismantling the system of governance itself. The cartels aren't a bug in the system, they are the system. The state isn't resisting reform because it's incompetent. It's resisting reform because transparency and accountability would expose just how deep the penetration goes. Judges protecting gang leaders, prosecutors sabotaging investigations, police commanders on cartel payrolls. This is what experts call the criminalization and delegitimization of the state. And the terrifying part? It's spreading. But if you think Mexico's deal with the devil is bad, wait until you see what happens when a state doesn't just share power with criminals, it becomes one. Venezuela was supposed to be rich. It has one of the world's largest proven oil reserves. It should be a regional powerhouse. Instead, it became the blueprint for how the 21st century democracy dissolves into a predatory criminal regime. Not through a military coup, but through the systematic capture of every institution that once held power in check. Today, Venezuela's primary economic output isn't oil, it's people. Over 8 million Venezuelans have fled the country since the crisis began, one of the largest refugee exodus in modern history. That's more than a third of the population, and they're not just fleeing poverty, they're fleeing a state that has weaponized human suffering as a tool of geopolitical leverage. Here's how it works. The Maduro regime doesn't just stop the exodus, it encourages it. Every Venezuelan who crosses into Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, or Chile relieves pressure on the collapsing economy back home. And every remittance those refugees send back keep the regime's foreign reserves afloat. Venezuela's debt is about 200% of its GDP. Its foreign exchange reserves have been stripped to almost nothing. The country is effectively bankrupt, but it's not alone. Russia, China, and Iran have all poured military and economic support into the regime, not because they believe in Maduro's ideology, but because keeping Venezuela unstable gives them a strategic toehold in the Western Hemisphere. The state has become a pawn in a global game it can no longer control, and that's where the real danger begins. When the Venezuelan state imploded, it didn't just export refugees, it exported its criminal infrastructure. One of the most powerful groups to emerge from this chaos is the Tren de Aragua, a prison gang that has transformed into a transnational criminal empire operating in more than 10 countries. They run extortion rackets in Chile, human trafficking in Peru, murder for hire in Colombia. The collapse of one state has metastasized into a regional security threat that no single government can contain, because the refugees fleeing Venezuela aren't just looking for work, they're entering labor markets, housing systems, and social services in countries that were already fragile. And when those systems buckle under the strain, local populations turn on the migrants, fueling the rise of authoritarian populism and further destabilizing the region. This is the cascade in action. Venezuela's failure doesn't stay in Venezuela, it spreads, and the next domino to fall was one nobody saw coming. And those fleeing Venezuela, they're not just escaping, they're carrying the virus of collapse with them. Ecuador used to be the stable one. While its neighbors burned, Ecuador was the quiet transit hub, a country where you could actually walk the streets at night. The homicide rate in 2019 was just 6.7 per 100,000 people, one of the lowest in Latin America. By 2023, it had exploded to 44.5 per 100,000. That's not a crime wave, that's a transformation. What happened? Ecuadorian street gangs. Groups like Los Corneros and Los Lobos went from local muscle to sophisticated transnational criminal superstructures. They partnered with Mexican cartels, they brought in Balkan organized crime, and they turned Ecuador into the cocaine superhighway to Europe. Experts estimate that 70% of the world's cocaine now passes through Ecuadorian ports. Think about that. 7 out of every 10 lines snorted in a London nightclub passed through Ecuador first. The port city of Guayaquil, once a bustling commercial hub, is now one of the most dangerous urban centers in the Americas, ranked just behind the worst cities in Brazil for homicides. But here's where it gets even worse. In 2023, Ecuadorian prosecutors launched an investigation called Metastasize. The name alone could tell you what they found. This wasn't just corruption, it was institutional cancer. High-ranking judges, prosecutors, and police commanders were systematically sabotaging investigations and releasing gang leaders in exchange for cash, gold, luxury assets, and real estate. The justice system wasn't failing to stop the gangs, the justice system was working for them. And even when the government tried to crack down, deploying the military, imposing states of emergency, launching mano dura, iron fist policies, it didn't work. Because you can't arrest your way out of a problem when the people doing the arresting are on the cartel payroll. By early 2025, the pressure on gang leadership had created a new problem: fragmentation. As top leaders were killed or captured, the gang splintered into dozens of smaller, more violent factions, all fighting for control, all trying to prove they were more ruthless. The violence didn't decrease, it got worse. This is what happens when stateness evaporates. The institutions meant to provide order became the primary vectors of chaos, and the population is left to fend for itself in a war zone that used to be their home. But at least Ecuador still has electricity. Cuba doesn't even have that anymore. Cuba's collapse isn't political, it's material. In 2024 and 2025, the island's national power grid experienced multiple complete collapses, leaving virtually the entire country in darkness for days at a time. Not rolling blackouts, total grid failure. When the Antonio Guterres power plant, the nation's largest, went offline in October 2024, it triggered a cascading blackout that knocked out every other plant in the country. The system is so old, so fragile, so chronically underfunded that a single failure can bring down the whole network. And it keeps happening. Cuba is now in a permanent state of infrastructure crisis. There's no electricity to run hospitals, no refrigeration to store medicine, no fuel to keep the generators running, and that's just the beginning. Approximately 70% of essential medicines are now unavailable or in short supply in Cuba. That's not a shortage, that's a healthcare system in freefall. Antibiotics, insulin, cancer drugs, basic painkillers, gone. And it's happening at the worst possible time. In October 2025, the Ministry of Public Health identified a complex epidemiological scenario, the simultaneous circulation of dengue, chikungunya, and Oropochi viruses. Mosquito-borne diseases are ripping through a population that has no medicine to treat them, no electricity to power the clinics that could help, and no functioning supply chain to replenish what's been lost. Then Hurricane Melissa hit. The storm damaged over 150,000 homes and left an estimated 2.2 million people, roughly 20% of the population, severely affected. That's not a natural disaster, that's a civilization-ending event for a state that no longer has the capacity to rebuild. And the Cuban government's response? Encourage people to leave. Since 2022, more than 1 million Cubans have fled the island. That's more than 10% of the population. And unlike past waves of migration, these aren't political dissidents, they're doctors, engineers, teachers, the exact people Cuba needs to rebuild. But the regime sees emigration as a pressure valve. Every person who leaves is one less mouth to feed, one less person demanding electricity, one less voice calling for change. This is what the death of stateness looks like in real time. The infrastructure fails, the health system collapses, the population flees, and then the state encourages it, because managing decline is easier than reversing it. Meanwhile, Nicaragua found a different way to profit from the chaos. Nicaragua's collapse is different. It's not about infrastructure or cartels or economic mismanagement, it's about the deliberate destruction of everything that makes a society function, and the weaponization of that destruction for political gain. In January 2025, Nicaragua's National Assembly ratified a constitutional rewrite that officially abolished judicial independence. There is no longer any expectation of the rule of law. If you invest in Nicaragua, you have no legal protection. If you speak out against the government, you have no legal recourse. The state isn't failing, it's succeeding at becoming a totalitarian machine. Since 2018, the Ortega Murillo regime has shut down and seized the assets of more than 5,700 organizations, NGOs, business chambers, universities, religious groups. This isn't a crackdown on political opponents, this is the erasure of civil society itself, the elimination of every space where citizens can organize, speak, or exist independently of the state. And here's the truly perverse part. Nicaragua has turned this repression into an economic model. In 2024, remittances hit a record $5.2 billion, accounting for 29% of the national GDP. That's the highest remittance dependency in the entire Western Hemisphere. The government forces people into exile and then collects the money those exiles send back to their families. It's a system that profits from its own cruelty. But Nicaragua's radicalization isn't just internal. The regime has weaponized migration as a geopolitical tool, by allowing migrants from other countries to transit through Nicaragua on their way to the US border. The Ortega government creates pressure on Washington while collecting fees and bribes from the smuggling networks that move people north. This is statecraft as extortion, and it works. Meanwhile, Nicaragua has become a strategic outpost for China, which has poured over $1 billion in loans and infrastructure investments into the country. China gets a foothold in Central America, Nicaragua gets the cash to keep the repression machine running, and the people, they're trapped in a country that has systematically destroyed every institution that could challenge the regime's power. Argentina's watching all of this and thinking, at least we're not that bad. They're wrong. Argentina used to define itself by its middle class, a population educated, cultured, upwardly mobile, a country that saw itself as the Europe of South America. That identity is being erased in real time. In September 2024, Argentina's annual inflation rate dipped to 209%. Not a typo, 209%. That means the money in your wallet loses half its value every few months. Saving accounts become worthless, salaries can't keep up, the psychological toll is devastating. People who once planned for the future now struggling to pay for groceries. This isn't just an economic crisis, it's the systematic destruction of a social class. The middle class built Argentina, They were the teachers, the doctors, the engineers, the small business owners, and now they're gone. Pushed into precarious labor, forced to juggle multiple jobs, watching their standard of living collapse in real time. And the worst part? This has happened before. Argentina has cycled through economic crises for decades. The currency collapses, the IMF steps in with loans, the government implements reforms, the economy stabilizes briefly, and then it falls apart again. Except this time, it might not recover. Argentina's debt is crushing, its dependency on the IMF is permanent, and the political system has turned toward radical populism as voters, desperate for anyone who promises change. Elect leaders who dismantle the very institutions that could stabilize the country. This is what economists call the globalization paradox. Argentina became the darling of international investors in the 1990s. Foreign capital poured in, the economy boomed, and then, when the foundations of that growth were revealed to be hollow, the capital fled just as quickly. The dollar virus. The withdrawal of funds, the collapse of the currency, the erosion of purchasing power, has infected the entire society. And there's no cure, just management of decline. When Argentina spirals, the shockwaves hit every market in the hemisphere. Its failure isn't just contained by its borders. It destabilizes trade, it undermines confidence, it proves to the rest of Latin America that even the most developed countries in the region are just one crisis away from collapse. And Honduras? It's where all these failures meet. Honduras is an endpoint of the cascade. It's where economic collapse, criminal governance, climate disaster, and political repression all converge into a single inescapable reality. Survival is a daily negotiation with forces beyond your control. Approximately 500 people flee Honduras every day. That's not a migration, that's hemorrhaging. And it's happening because the Honduran state has essentially given up on protecting its citizens from the predatory reach of gangs, cartels, and extortion networks. In rural communities, people are pushed out by organized crime or climate-driven poverty. They migrate to the cities hoping for better conditions. But urban Honduras is just as dangerous. Rampant violence, no economic opportunity, gangs controlling entire neighborhoods. So they flee the country. This creates what researchers call the stages of displacement. First, you lose your home, then you lose your city. Finally, you lose your country. And at each stage, the state is nowhere to be found. For the average Honduran, the government isn't a source of protection, it's an obstacle. Survival means negotiating with the gangs who control the buses, the markets, the neighborhoods. You pay extortion fees to get to work. You stay silent when you witness violence. You teach your children to never speak to outsiders. This is the life in a hollowed out state. The institutions still exist on paper, but in practice, they've ceded all meaningful power to the non-state actors who operate with impunity. And the violence isn't random, it's systemic. It's a tool of control, and it works. Here's the thing about cascades, they don't stop on their own. Each of these collapses is connected, each one makes the next one worse, and the feedback loop is now self-sustaining. When Venezuela implodes, it sends 8 million refugees across the continent. Those refugees overwhelm the labor markets and housing systems in Ecuador, Colombia, Peru, and Chile. The local populations, already struggling, turn on the migrants. Social tensions rise. Populist authoritarians gain power by promising to restore order. And those authoritarians, whether left or right, tend to dismantle the very institutions that could prevent the next collapse. Meanwhile, the criminal networks that govern parts of Mexico aren't staying in Mexico. They're going transnational. The Sinaloa cartel works with the Los Coneros in Ecuador, Los Coneros work with Balkan mafias in Europe, Trendy Aragua operates in 10 countries. These groups now form a global illegal economy that rivals the GDP of major nations. And when the state tries to fight back, they realize the problem isn't just external, it's internal. The judges are compromised, the police are on the payroll, the prosecutors sabotage investigations. You can't reform a system that's already been hollowed out from within. Then there's the debt. Argentina, Venezuela, Nicaragua, they're all trapped in cycles of borrowing funds they can never repay. And as they become more dependent on loans from China or the IMF, they lose the ability to act as a cohesive regional bloc. They lose sovereignty, they become pawns. And the final accelerant, climate. Cuba's hurricanes, Honduras droughts. Infrastructure that was already failing now faces environmental pressures it was never built to withstand. And when the power goes out, when the water stops running, when the hospitals close, the population doesn't wait for help. They leave. This is the cascade. Economic failures fuel migrations, migrations overwhelm neighbors, overwhelmed neighbors turn to authoritarian solutions, authoritarians dismantle institutions, weakened institutions are captured by criminals, criminals govern territories become launching pads for transnational crime, and the cycle accelerates. There's no external cavalry coming to stop it. The inter-American system is fractured. The United States is focused inwards. The international community is paralyzed by competing interests, and the countries themselves, they're trapped in a system failure so complete that recovery would require rebuilding stateness itself, restoring the ability to tax, to protect, to administer basic services. That's not a reform, that's a generational project, and right now, nobody has the political will or the resources to attempt it. So what does this mean for the region, for the hemisphere, and for you? It means the map of Latin America is being redrawn in real time, not by governments, but by cartels, by refugee flows, by debt traps, and by the slow, grinding collapse of institutions that once held societies together. The borders are still there, but they're just lines on a map. Criminal networks ignore them, refugees cross them, and states are learning that sovereignty is an illusion when you don't have the capacity to govern your own territory. This is the death of stateness, the moment when a region realizes the 20th century model of the nation-state no longer works, that the institutions designed to provide order, security, and prosperity have been captured, corrupted, or simply abandoned. And the scariest part? It's not just happening in Latin America. This is the blueprint for state failure in the 21st century, and the dominoes are still falling. So, here's the question we should all be asking. What happens when the cascade reaches the US border, and there's nowhere left to run? Let us know what you think in the comments, and if you want to stay ahead of the stories shaping the world, subscribe to Fall of Nations.